This playlist collects and organizes the segments of the first lecture on universal moral principles and the philosophy or ethical theory of Immanuel Kant. This lecture is going to approach this material and emphasize things using a different narrative than the two chapters from Rachel's. And I do this for primarily two reasons. On the one hand, I want to include more background information about Kant, his ideological influences, and his body of work. And secondly, I want to explicate Kant's theory using slightly more technical and conceptual apparatus than Rachel's uses, and emphasizing things that are important to Kant that are not mentioned or not emphasized in Rachel's exposition. And so I'll present Kant's theory by outlining, presenting the theory following his own outline, presentation, and defense in a book called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which he published in 1785. Rachel spends a fair amount of time talking about Kant's arguments for specific views in ethics about the nature of punishment or whether or not it's ever ethically permissible to lie. And while those are interesting, I'm not going to emphasize these in my lectures. So for that material, you'll need to rely primarily on the Rachel's readings. My emphasis will be primarily on the exposition of Kant and placing his view within the context of deontological theories in a more explicit way. So I'll start off this lecture by talking a little bit about Kant's life and his intellectual influences. Then I'll talk about deontological ethical theories generally, what they are, and contrast them with consequentialist theories, and explain why Kant is considered to be one of the paradigmatic examples of a deontological ethical theory. And then I'll begin to present and defend Kant's theory following the same roadmap that Kant uses in the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And specifically in this lecture, I'll present his theory insofar as he presents and defends it in that first chapter. In the second lecture, I'll present and defend the theory as he does in the second chapter of that book. And that's as far into that book as I'll go in the exposition. That's as much of the theory as I'll lay out. So my exposition is going to be more technical and conceptual than Rachel's is. Rachel's does an excellent job of presenting it in a comprehensible way, but in doing so, I find that he presents it in ways that don't respect some of the things that are important to Kant and that deprive students of a little of the conceptual apparatus that I think is useful to understand Kant. And so my exposition is going to be slightly more technical, though I've gone to great lengths to try and minimize the number of technical terms that I introduce and use in presenting his theory. Nevertheless, it'll be slightly more so. And understanding Kant's concepts, terms, and his theory will be more the job of this lecture than the readings in Rachel, really. So this is Immanuel Kant. He was born April 22nd in 1724 in Königsberg, in the capital city of what was then East Prussia. His father's a harness maker, and his family belongs to a Protestant sect of pious. So pious emphasize both biblical doctrine, in which ways they have affinities to Lutheranism, and the piety of the individual pursuing a vigorous Christian life, which gives them affinities to the Puritans. And so it's a very sort of puritanistic, doctrinal religious view. And this view not only provides the background in Kant's youth for his formulation of his ethical thinking, but his early education is exclusively in these religious, pious schools. He begins his education at St. George's Hospital School until he enters Collegium Fredericum, which is a pious sort of preparatory school. In 1737, his mother dies of rheumatic fever, and so his early life isn't devoid of tragedy. In 1740, he enters Albertus University of Königsberg. And there, he's going to study until 1746 when his father dies. And he studies philosophy, primarily continental rationalism, figures like Descartes, for example, but he studies under someone who has some familiarity with British empiricism. And indeed, a lot of Kant's thinking seems to have been sparked by an awareness of the British empiricists, at least sort of generally. There's not a lot of evidence that he actually read, for instance, Hume. But he certainly says that he was responding to the doctrines of Hume in, for instance, the Critique of Pure Reason. So he studies philosophy, but he also studies mathematics and science. And in fact, he not only studies them, but in his early academic career, he makes significant contributions to science, particularly to astronomy, and also to mathematics. So in 1774, we find him winning the Berlin Academy Prize for his work regarding the Earth's rotation. And by this time, he's well versed in Newtonian physics, and he believes Newtonian physics is the one true theory about the nature of terrestrial and celestial motions. And we see this reflected in the Critique of Pure Reason as well. So in 1755, we find him publishing a book called General History of Nature and Theory of the Heavens. And this is a work in astronomy and physics. And in it, he articulates, for instance, the nebular hypothesis regarding the formation of the solar system. He speculates that the Milky Way is actually in the shape of a disk and that it might also be like a spinning nebular structure. And in this way, he's fluent in Newtonian physics, and he's a pretty insightful astronomer. He works as a private tutor until 1755. At that point, he becomes a Privatdozent, which is a lecturer who works for fees. So he's a private individual who gives lectures that he charges admission for. And you might think, well, he must have been quite poor, because who would pay for that? But in fact, in universities at this time, there isn't a lot of explicit curriculum. There are no syllabi, there aren't a lot of formal lectures. And so students who wish to master the material for the purposes of the major point of university, which is testing on subjects, often will pay or go to private lecturers or tutors. And Kant was also a tutor at Königsberg. So he makes his money this way for a little over 5 or 10 years, really. Now, around 1760, his research starts to turn increasingly from science and astronomy and mathematics towards philosophy and logic. And in the 1760s, he publishes a number of works in philosophy. He publishes a work in theology. He publishes a work in ethics. He publishes a work largely in the philosophy of science. In 1770, he then, on the strength of his work in philosophy and logic, accepts the logic and metaphysics chair at the University of Königsberg and becomes an official member of the university. And he holds that position from that time until 1798. And throughout his career, both when he was a tutor and a private lecturer, and when he was an official professor, he was a popular lecturer and a popular figure, and said that there were actually people standing outside his lecture halls listening through the door to his lectures. That's how popular and good they were. He was certainly an eccentric figure. People claimed you could set the clock by when he took his afternoon constitutional. He was also odd in a number of other ways. There are lots of peculiar stories about Kant. But in general, he was an insightful, popular member of the academic community, starts his research in the philosophy of science, but drifts slowly but surely towards logic and philosophy, where he makes his primary contributions. So his writings include these works in logic and these works in science. His most famous philosophical works include this 3-book series of critiques. The Critique of Pure Reason talks about metaphysics and the basis of our knowledge of the physical world. The Critique of Practical Reason is a treatise in ethical subjects. And the Critique of Judgment, the last critique, contains an exposition of his aesthetic views, talks about critiques of theological judgments, and also includes a sort of summary of the salient points in the first 2 critiques. And these 3 books are the primary volumes that people who study Kant and philosophy look at. Now, the work I'm going to discuss in this lecture is from the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which Kant publishes in 1785. And Kant intends this as a preliminary work, building up to his work, The Critique of Practical Reason, which is his major ethical theory contribution that he publishes 3 years later in 1788.